Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Quinlan Drake bought a house on a cliff overlooking the ocean, he thought he had found a place for privacy, away from bureaucracy and intrusive neighbors. But an unexpected letter from the local HOA soon turned his dream into a real nightmare that he wasn't going to lose. Quinlan Drake had spent years working tirelessly, saving every possible penny, and searching for the perfect home. He wasn't just looking for any house. He wanted something secluded, a place that offered peace and solitude, away from the suffocating rules and restrictions of homeowners associations. And finally, he had found it. A breathtaking two-story home perched on a rugged California cliffside, overlooking the vast Pacific Ocean. The moment he stepped onto the property, he felt an instant connection. The air was crisp with the scent of salt water, and the rhythmic crash of the waves against the rocks below created a tranquil atmosphere. The house itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture with large glass windows that invited the ocean view inside. A wraparound balcony provided an unobstructed panorama of the endless blue horizon, and the spacious backyard was lined with sturdy wooden fencing, ensuring privacy. His real estate agent, a charming woman named Melissa Carter, had been exceptionally thorough during the purchasing process. She had reassured him multiple times that this property was not subject to any homeowners association HOA regulations. That was a non-negotiable factor for Quinlan. He had no interest in dealing with nosy neighbors, arbitrary fines, or ridiculous community guidelines dictating the color of his mailbox or how he landscaped his yard. "Are you sure this place is completely free from an HOA?" he had asked Melissa at least 3 times before signing the papers. She had smiled confidently. "Absolutely. This lot was originally part of the association's jurisdiction, but it was sold off years ago. You're not required to follow any HOA rules. It's all yours, with no strings attached." With that assurance, Quinlan signed the documents, and the house was officially his. The day he moved in, he felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. He had worked hard for this moment, and now he could finally enjoy the rewards of his dedication. The first few weeks in the house were blissful. He spent his evenings watching the sun sink into the ocean, sipping a glass of whiskey on his balcony, and relishing the solitude. He made a few upgrades, installing a state-of-the-art security system, setting up an underground irrigation system for the garden, and even adding a new fire pit area in the backyard for cool coastal nights. Everything seemed perfect. But then, the letter arrived. It was tucked inside his mailbox one morning, an official-looking envelope addressed to him. At first, he assumed it was some sort of property tax notice or a welcome letter from the local utilities. But as he tore it open and scanned the contents, his stomach twisted into a knot. The letter was from the Seacliff Homeowners Association, informing him that his house was in violation of HOA regulations. They claimed that his 2-story home obstructed the ocean view of other residents in the community. Confused, Quinlan reread the letter. It made no sense. He wasn't part of their HOA. Melissa had made that very clear. Yet at the bottom of the letter, there was an ominous warning. Failure to comply with the HOA's request to modify or sell the property will result in legal action. Quinlan's hands clenched into fists. This was supposed to be his dream home, but now it seemed that his nightmare was only beginning. Quinlan stood in his kitchen, gripping the HOA letter tightly in his hands, his pulse hammering in his ears. The words on the page were absurd. Legal action for obstructing a view. He had deliberately bought this house outside of any homeowners association to avoid nonsense like this. Determined to clear up the misunderstanding, he grabbed his phone and dialed Melissa Carter, his real estate agent. "Melissa, I just got a letter from the Seacliff HOA," he said, struggling to keep his voice level. "They're claiming my house is violating their regulations. That doesn't make any sense. You told me this property wasn't under their control." There was a brief silence on the other end before Melissa spoke, her tone puzzled. "That can't be right. I double-checked everything before the sale. Your lot hasn't been part of the HOA for years." "Well, someone clearly thinks otherwise," Quinlan snapped, pacing the room. "They're threatening legal action." Melissa sighed. "Okay, let me look into this. I'll call you back as soon as I have answers." Quinlan hung up, irritation bubbling beneath the surface. He had expected to spend his time in this house enjoying the tranquility, not dealing with legal threats. A few days later, Melissa called back, and the news wasn't good. "There's a loophole," she admitted, her voice tight. Technically, your land was originally part of the HOA's jurisdiction. Even though it was sold off separately, there's an old clause that allows the HOA to impose certain restrictions on it. Quinlan exhaled sharply. Are you kidding me? That's ridiculous. The house wasn't even built when they last had jurisdiction over the land. I know, Melissa agreed, but the HOA is exploiting this clause to pressure you into compliance. Quinlan's jaw tightened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move. The HOA didn't just want him to modify his house. They wanted him gone. Days later, things escalated. First, a man in a pressed polo shirt and an arrogant smirk showed up at his door. He introduced himself as Walter Green, the HOA president. We understand that you're new to the neighborhood, Mr. Drake, he said smoothly, though there was an unmistakable sharpness behind his words. And we understand that you may not have been aware of our community guidelines when you purchased your home. Quinlan folded his arms. I was very aware that my house isn't part of your HOA. Walter gave him a condescending smile. That's a bit of a gray area. You see, we take great pride in maintaining the integrity of our community. Your house, well, it disrupts the scenic harmony of our neighborhood. Quinlan's patience was thinning. Let me guess. You want me to sell my home to you? Walter's smile widened. You're a smart man. Quinlan let out a sharp laugh. Not happening. Walter sighed theatrically. I was hoping we could resolve this amicably, Mr. Drake, but if you insist on being difficult, well, let's just say we have ways of handling these matters. Quinlan felt a flicker of unease at the veiled threat, but he refused to be intimidated. Then I guess I'll see you in court. Walter's eyes darkened, but he gave a small nod before turning away. As Quinlan watched him walk back to his car, a cold realization settled in. This wasn't going to be a simple legal dispute. This was war. Quinlan knew the battle had begun the moment Walter Green walked away from his doorstep. The HOA wasn't just going to rely on legal tactics. They were going to make his life hell. The first signs were small, petty nuisances. He woke up one morning to find his mailbox mysteriously removed from its post, lying in the middle of the street. A few days later, his trash cans were knocked over, their contents strewn across his driveway. At first, he thought it was just bad luck, but the frequency of these incidents quickly became too consistent to ignore. Then came the letters, fines, violations, and absurd warnings, all signed by the HOA. They claimed his lawn was not in accordance with community standards. His security cameras were an eyesore. His porch lights were too bright. It was nonsense. He wasn't even part of their HOA. Quinlan documented everything, snapping pictures of the letters and the damage, preparing for the inevitable legal battle. But the HOA wasn't finished. One night, his irrigation system stopped working. After checking the underground pipes, he discovered they had been deliberately cut. He installed new security cameras, adjusting the angles to cover more of his property. 2 days later, someone spray-painted the lenses black. That was when he realized they weren't just trying to inconvenience him, they were actively sabotaging his home. The situation escalated even further when he checked his car one morning. All 4 tires were slashed. Furious, he checked the security footage from the night before, only to find the cameras had been tampered with yet again. Quinlan had had enough. He took the footage he had left, the vandalized property, and the repeated letters, and he filed a police report for harassment and property damage. The officers took notes, but he could tell they weren't going to prioritize it. It's probably just some local kids messing around, one of them said. Quinlan clenched his fists. No, it's not. It's my HOA. The officer raised an eyebrow. You're not in their HOA, are you? No. Quinlan growled, but that hasn't stopped them. That night, he barely slept. The HOA was making it clear that this wasn't just about legal technicalities. They wanted to break him. And for the first time, he started to wonder just how far they were willing to go. Quinlan sat in the courtroom, his fingers tapping impatiently on the polished wooden table. This was it. The showdown. Across the aisle sat Walter Green, the smug president of the HOA, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits. They looked confident, too confident. They had been harassing him for months, escalating from passive-aggressive letters to full-blown sabotage. But now it was time for them to answer for it. Quinlan's lawyer, Daniel Hartman, stood first. He laid out the case clearly. Quinlan Drake was not part of the Seacliff HOA. the HOA had no legal authority to impose fines, restrictions, or regulations on his property. They had engaged in targeted harassment, vandalism, and coercion to try to force him to sell. To drive the point home, Daniel presented security footage, police reports, and dozens of letters from the HOA, each more absurd than the last. The most damning piece of evidence? Internal HOA emails obtained through a subpoena. The emails revealed exactly what Quinlan had suspected all along. Walter Green and his board members had been discussing ways to make his life unbearable, openly strategizing about ways to force him out. One email from Walter himself read, "He won't last long. If we make it difficult enough, he'll cave. He either sells to us or suffers." Quinlan's hands clenched into fists. That was all the proof he needed. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that they were only enforcing community standards, but it was clear to everyone in the room that this was a personal vendetta. The judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, was unimpressed. When she spoke, Walter's confident smirk finally wavered. "Mr. Drake is not a member of your HOA. Your association has no legal claim over his property. Furthermore, the evidence suggests deliberate harassment and intimidation. This lawsuit is dismissed, and any further attempts to impose HOA rules on him will be considered a violation of his property rights." Quinlan had won. The court erupted in murmurs as Walter sat stone-faced, his fingers tightening around his chair's armrest. Quinlan knew this wasn't over. Walter wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat gracefully. As Quinlan left the courtroom, Walter caught his eye. "You think this is finished?" Walter muttered, his voice cold. "You're making a mistake." Quinlan leaned in slightly, keeping his expression calm. "So did you." Then he walked away, victorious, for now. But he had no idea just how much worse things were about to get. Quinlan had hoped that after his victory in court, the HOA would finally back off, but he should have known better. Walter Green was not the type to take a loss lightly. If anything, the lawsuit had only made him more determined to retaliate in ways that the legal system wouldn't immediately catch. The first warning came just a week after the trial. Quinlan woke up one morning to find his driveway covered in broken glass. Not just shattered bottles, hundreds of tiny shards spread evenly, deliberately. If he hadn't noticed before backing his car out, his tires would have been completely destroyed. Then came the fake complaints. The city suddenly had multiple reports about his house being in violation of construction permits. An anonymous tip accused him of running an illegal business from his home. A fake noise complaint was filed, resulting in a police officer knocking on his door late at night. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. Walter was using every bureaucratic trick in the book to make his life miserable. Quinlan wasn't having it. He documented everything, photographed the broken glass, recorded conversations with city officials, and forwarded every fake complaint to his lawyer. But deep down, he knew this wasn't going to stop Walter. Then, things turned personal. One evening, Quinlan returned home to find something that made his blood run cold. A dead, gutted fish had been nailed to his front door. A crude note was stuffed into its mouth. "Sell now, or else." He immediately called the police, but they did nothing. "There's no direct proof that it was the HOA," they said. "No witnesses, no security footage of the act." That night, Quinlan made a decision. If the HOA was willing to break the law, then he would make sure they paid for it, every single thing they did. So he went on the offensive. Using his lawyer, he filed multiple restraining orders against Walter Green and two other key members of the HOA board, preventing them from stepping foot on his property. Then he hired a private investigator. Within days, the investigator dug up dirt on Walter Green, fraudulent HOA funds, backdoor deals with local contractors, and illegal financial activity. Quinlan grinned. Now, Walter wasn't just harassing a homeowner, he was facing potential criminal charges. But before Quinlan could act on it, Walter made his biggest mistake yet, a mistake that would land him in prison. The night was unusually quiet. The wind carried the scent of salt from the ocean, and the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs created a deceptive sense of tranquility. Quinlan sat in his living room, staring at his security monitors. He had a bad feeling. Ever since the dead fish warning, the attacks had only escalated. The HOA's harassment had turned criminal, and he knew Walter Green was behind it. Something told him the worst was yet to come. Then, at exactly 2:37 a.m., the motion sensors in his front yard triggered an alert. Quinlan's eyes snapped to the screen. A figure was moving in the shadows. The person was careful, deliberate, avoiding the main security cameras, but Quinlan had learned from his mistakes. He had installed hidden cameras along the fence line after the last incident. He switched the feed, and his breath caught in his throat. It was Walter Green. The HOA president was carrying a red gasoline canister. Quinlan's blood ran cold. This wasn't vandalism. This was arson. Walter moved with chilling efficiency, unscrewing the cap and pouring the gasoline along the wooden support beams of the front porch. Then he moved toward the side of the house, coating the grass near the propane tank. Quinlan grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "I have an intruder on my property attempting arson. I have it on video. Send police and fire rescue immediately." But as he spoke, something unexpected happened. Walter, in his hurry, made a fatal mistake. As he emptied the last of the gasoline near the garage, some splashed onto his pants. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a matchbook. His hands were shaking. Whether from excitement or rage, Quinlan couldn't tell. The match ignited. Walter flicked it toward the porch, expecting a small blaze. But the moment the flame made contact, the fire roared to life. And then, in a split second of horrifying realization, Walter looked down at himself. His pants were on fire. The flames leaped up his leg, consuming the fabric. Walter let out a blood-curdling scream, stumbling backward, dropping the matchbook into the gasoline puddle behind him. The fire exploded outward, catching the bushes and licking at the garage door. Quinlan rushed outside, staying at a safe distance, his phone still pressed to his ear. Walter was on the ground, rolling frantically, slapping at his legs. His screams had already woken the neighbors. Porch lights flicked on. Doors creaked open. A few neighbors ran outside, their eyes widening in shock as they saw flames spreading rapidly across Quinlan's property, and Walter writhing on the ground. Within moments, the wail of sirens cut through the night. The police arrived first, followed by the fire department. Firefighters jumped into action, spraying water to contain the flames before they could reach the main house. Walter, his skin red and blistered, was coughing violently. His jeans were blackened, melted in some areas where the fire had burned through. A police officer ran up to him, pulling out handcuffs. "Stay down, sir. You're under arrest for attempted arson and destruction of property." Walter whimpered. His hands shook as he tried to protest, but the video footage spoke louder than any lie he could tell. Quinlan walked up to him, staring down at the man who had made his life hell. Walter met his gaze, his face twisted in pain. You set me up," he croaked. Quinlan scoffed. "No, Walter, you did this to yourself." As the police loaded the disgraced HOA president into the back of the cruiser, the nightmare was finally over. But Walter Green was about to face a nightmare of his own. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back row, their cameras flashing as Walter Green was led in, his wrists shackled. The once arrogant HOA president now looked like a shell of his former self. His face was still raw from the burns, the skin on his hands a mottled pink. His lawyer sat stiffly beside him, undoubtedly aware that they were fighting a losing battle. Across the room, Quinlan sat with his attorney, Daniel Hartman. He had attended every single court hearing, refusing to let Walter escape justice. The prosecution didn't need much to build their case. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage clearly showed Walter pouring gasoline around the property. The matchbook he used had his fingerprints all over it. Witnesses, Quinlan's neighbors, had seen the flames and heard Walter's screams. The real kicker came when the prosecutor revealed Walter's financial records. The HOA president had been trying to manipulate property values. He had planned to burn Quinlan's house, forcing him to sell for pennies, only for Walter's own investment firm to buy it at a fraction of the price. It was fraud. It was arson. It was conspiracy. And now he was going to pay. When the judge read the verdict, the room was deathly silent. "Walter Green, you are found guilty of arson, attempted destruction of private property, criminal harassment, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You are sentenced to 20 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. Walter's face crumbled. His lawyer whispered something to him, but it didn't matter. It was over, but it didn't end there. The HOA itself was hit with a massive lawsuit. They were found guilty of negligence and complicity in harassment, knowingly allowing criminal behavior, engaging in fraudulent real estate schemes. The result? The entire HOA board was removed, and the association was forced to pay Quinlan $3.2 million in damages. As Walter was led away in handcuffs, Quinlan exhaled for the first time in months. He had won. For real this time. Quinlan stood on his balcony, the salty ocean breeze ruffling his hair as he gazed at the horizon. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. The war with the HOA was over. Walter Green was rotting in prison, his once powerful grip on the neighborhood reduced to nothing but bitter memories. The rest of the HOA board had either resigned or been forcibly removed after the lawsuit. The association itself was on the verge of collapse, drowning under millions of dollars in fines and legal fees. Quinlan had come out victorious, richer, stronger, and completely untouchable. His phone buzzed on the patio table. It was his lawyer, Daniel Hartman. "Enjoying your well-earned peace?" Daniel's voice held an unmistakable note of satisfaction. Quinlan chuckled. "You could say that." "Well, I just wanted to let you know," Daniel continued. "The final paperwork has gone through. The court officially ruled that your property is permanently exempt from any HOA jurisdiction, now and in the future. No one will ever be able to pull this kind of stunt again." Quinlan grinned. That was the last piece of the puzzle. Not only had he defeated Walter and bankrupted the HOA, but his victory set a legal precedent. His home would forever remain free from any future homeowner association interference. Word of his triumph spread fast. Real estate investors took notice, and the value of his property skyrocketed. Neighbors, formerly silent out of fear, suddenly rallied against the HOA, refusing to pay dues or recognize its authority. The new HOA board, desperate to regain credibility, issued an official apology. But Quinlan, he didn't care. He had won the war. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Melissa Carter, his real estate agent, standing on his porch with a bottle of champagne. "I figured you could use this," she said, handing it to him with a smile. Quinlan laughed, accepting the bottle. "You were right about one thing, Melissa." "Oh? What's that?" He looked back at his house, his sanctuary that no one would ever take from him. "I really did pick the perfect home." As he popped the cork and poured himself a drink, he finally allowed himself to relax. No more harassment, no more threats, no more HOA tyranny. Just him, his dream home, and the ocean stretching endlessly before him. Quinlan had not only survived, he had won.